What's happening, folks? Back with another reaction, back with some more acid-techno, and we're back with an absolute classic, which comes from a couple folks who are deeply involved in multiple acid-techno labels of Godfather status, which is to say we're going to listen to a remix by the Vibe Bar Rejects, which consisted of Steve Smitten, legendary acid-techno label boss who not only ran his own incredibly epic label Smitten, but who was involved in the early Rootmaster releases as well. And one of the greatest things of doing reactions starting, I was going to say a couple years ago, now 3 years ago, was that when I began, as many people know, I was doing almost exclusively acid techno and a bit of punk rock, as well as, hardcore and some other underground genres. That was where I began doing reactions, because that was the space that I saw that was not suitably covered by other reactors. Now, since then, I've reacted to all sorts of things, pop music and classical and jazz and pretty much everything under the sun, but I still react to acid techno and hardcore and these other genres. And yes, one of the greatest things is once I began reacting to some tunes on Smitten's label, Smitten, as well as some of the sub-labels like Smitten XS and Smitten is Dead, which was a later reincarnation, Steve Smitten actually reached out to me via Discogs, and we had a back and forth and, had a conversation about the old school days and also what his label meant to me as someone who is of a slightly younger generation, which is to say I was born in 1980, so I started going to parties like late 96, early 97, and by then Smitten was already putting out records, Rootmaster was already putting out records, Stay It Forever was already putting out records. So again, I'm a little bit younger than the godfathers of the acid scene, though fair to say now older than a lot of other people who have gotten into acid techno and some of the younger generation of producers in the genre. And yeah, I had a talk with him about his label and why I thought it was so great, and he was saying, back then we weren't thinking about it too much, we weren't worrying about, what other people thought, we were making the kind of music that we wanted to hear at the parties we were going to on the sound systems that we had. And I thought that was very telling, because oftentimes in creative endeavors, if you're overthinking things, if you're trying to tailor or adjust what you're doing in relation to what people might think, or worrying overly about what other people will like, what critics think of it, and so on, you'll end up with a product that is neither here nor there, so to speak. Whereas again, if you're just pursuing a sound and pursuing a style and indeed a lifestyle, then I think it comes off more naturally, and the tunes will by themselves be more legendary and more perfect even in a much later retrospective than they would be again if you were doing them for more commercial purposes or whatever. And to be clear, there's nothing wrong with a techno track being commercial. Indeed, I think One Night in Hackney is one of the best selling acid techno tunes ever, and that is a great tune. So again, these are all complicated issues, but I had a really good talk over the course of I think a few weeks, maybe a couple months, with Steve Smitten. I'm friends with him on Facebook now, so yeah, that was a really cool moment. And Vibe Bar Rejects is Steve Smitten mixed with Dave the drummer, aka Henry Cullen, another old school legend who is still producing and doing shows today. Indeed, I saw him at a party, and I think it was technically Hawthorne, maybe it was just downtown LA, but yeah, I saw him a couple years ago. I actually did a vlog of it, to speak with more enunciation on my channel. So if you type into my channel, if you search for techno party vlog or something, it'll come up, and he was the headliner at that event, was Dave the drummer, who his real name again is Henry Cullen. I don't know where the Dave comes from, but the drummer is because he was a drummer in a band called Back to the Planet from many years ago with Carl Hendricks, one of the guys from Audio Pancake, and I believe Guy the Geezer McGaffer was also in it. So again, a lot of acid techno artists have backgrounds in other bands, especially like punk rock bands, and people will know, when I talk about acid techno, I've always maintained that it is essentially the punk rock of the techno/rave world, and that's what drew me to it immediately, because I had been going to punk shows for a couple years in the mid-90s before I discovered acid techno, which, once again, to tell the story, I discovered acid techno after my brother introduced me to rave parties and Goa Trance. Goa Trance was the first real underground dance music I heard, and I loved it. And when I talked to him about it. I was like, hey, I love this stuff, and I want to go to these parties with you and your friends and so on. But what's that sound in some of these Goa tracks? My brother was like, oh, that's the acid sound. I think it's made by the 303. There's entire genres devoted to that. And I said, let me go learn more. And the rest is history. So yes, Vibe Bar Rejects, it was a duo. I don't know how many records they put out. I feel like they did more remixes than their own releases. But yeah, Steve Smitten was, I think, primarily the label boss, but he did get involved in production in some cases, especially with Henry as part of Vibe Bar Rejects. This is a remix they did for a track by Sharkey, whose real name I'm forgetting, but he's another person who produced under a whole bunch of different names. I think Sharkey was the alias he used for Happy Hardcore, which people will know I'm into early hardcore gabber, like the old school gabber, as well as early hardcore, meaning hardcore made now, but in the early gabber style. And I also like other types of hardcore. Happy hardcore's never been my favorite, but I don't really knock on it. It's never a genre I really got into, but I do know that Sharkey was a big name in that world. So if people follow happy hardcore, surely they'll know who Sharkey was. In any case, this is a remix of a track Sharkey did called Product of Society, which I think lends itself especially well to acid-techno. Again, acid-techno, it has sort of a punk rock ethos, not only in terms of the DIY nature of the labels and the parties in the acid-techno world, which again, sometimes are squat parties, just finding a warehouse and making it your own space for a few hours and, having it in a real energetic and enjoyable way, but also because of the lyrics, if you will, or rather samples in many cases, although in some cases they're actually like recorded vocals. But yes, a lot of acid techno tracks have vocals and samples that take a punk critical view of society, so a track called Product of Society in acid techno form seems like a perfect marriage to me, so let's hear it. This is the Vibe Bar Rejects. It's actually not listed as that. It's listed as the Smitten's Once Bitten remix, which I like Smitten, Once Bitten. There's a nice alliterative rhyme to that. But it says in the credits here that it's by Vibe Bar Rejects, which again is Steve Smitten and Henry Cullen. And it is ultimately on React. And React is not really a label that I associate with acid techno. It's more of like a trance label, and it goes back to the early days. I think eventually it went all digital and then was under new management. So the old React is not the React that I think technically still exists, though I wonder if, they actually have the rights to the old catalog, because, that's what happens. Like Eve is another great example. Pablo Gargano and Simon Eve's label, eventually it was under new management, and they tried to, put out like a different style, but they still had, I think, control over the older Eve catalog. So, the stories of labels and distribution and so on, they're often adjacent to the music because, there's larger forces at work when it comes to releasing vinyl and so on. But again, React is sort of an old school trance label, and I think the mix on the other side, which is like the Sundance mix or something, I think it is sort of a trance remix. But yeah, for me, the reason I got this record was always for the Smitten's Once Bitten mix. Here we go, Sharkey, Product of Society, Smitten's Once Bitten mix on React 1998. You're like, shut up and play the tune, man. At least that's what Luke is saying. Again, note the tempo. This is default tempo. It's got pace. That little whistle synth. It reminds me, and that sort of like car zooming by Doppler effect, and that heavy bass. But yeah, that whistle synth reminds me of a track by DDR and the Geezer called Sabretooth, which I should react to at some point as well. electricity, the energy just like ramping up quickly. Double time ride symbol. Gurgling, growling. Little accent. Wicked dissonant synth. I mean, that main electrically charged acid line just whipping about, and then every once in a while that flare, that accent flare. It's like it's like downshifting, upshifting, like the level just keeps dynamically moving. Incredible. It's brilliant. It's just a tune that leaves you stunned. Indeed. And I remember talking to Steve about this, and he was saying, there is sort of a connection. But even before I had that conversation, I remember thinking, like, this, it sort of reminds me of, like, a lighter version of Brown Nun, which is by Vibe Bar Rejects, if I'm remembering correctly. Maybe it's under a different name. No, I think it's Vibe Bar Rejects. But yeah, that one is like the dark, heavier, more wicked version of this, and that both tunes start powerfully, but then just fly off the handle and just go wicked and wild and keep like upping the intensity. In this version, it has a lighter, more euphoric type of feel, whereas Brown Nun has a more intense, the walls are crumbling around you sort of feel. But they do remind me of each other, even though in some ways they're very different, if that makes sense. But yes, I just love the way it keeps upping the intensity, especially after the break, but even before the break. As I said, it's like the acid work is like shifting up and then shifting back down, but it never lets you get comfortable. It just keeps moving around. The whistling synth gives it a bit of like light caprice, but then that, gnarled sort of metallic, electric metallic dissonant synth is very much what I think of when I think of London style acid techno, and perhaps also like the cluster sound, which someone once aptly described to me as acid techno without the acid. Now, to be fair, the cluster label is not my favorite in the Stay Up Forever world, precisely because it tends to be 303 minimal with like a few exceptions, which is to say the temperature drop release with like, what is it, fatty acid, and there's a couple others. That one has a lot of acid, but most cluster doesn't. But cluster tracks do tend to have those wicked kind of synths, and I associate that very much with like the London techno / acid techno sound. So yeah, it's just the best of the old school acid techno world. Now again, it's 98. 98 is not exactly, the early golden days, but I still think it's within the larger golden days definition. I think by the time you get to 2000, some of those older labels were either winding up and finishing off. Again, I don't remember when the last proper Smitten record was, but eventually it went away for a little while, and then they came back for a 10 record run under the name Smitten is Dead, which typically included one of the original Smitten tracks with a remix. But yes, it's still, I think, in the end of the original phase of the acid techno golden days. And by 98 I was going to parties like every weekend. Again, I started 96, like for the first part of 97, it was still like I was kind of a punk rocker who happened to be going to techno parties. And then by mid to late 97, it was like, oh, like this is actually my home. Like, I never realized this. But yeah, so I think it's an absolutely cracking track. I don't remember exactly when I got it. I'd say, I don't know, mid 2000s or something by the time I started using Discogs, which is to say I got my turntables in 98. People will know, I've told the story, a lot of the earliest stuff I got was like acid trance, hard trance, progressive trance, some hard house. And so, by the turn of the millennium, online stores became more common and you could search for things specifically, and by then I just learned more about certain acid techno labels. And then when you get to Discogs, and I could sort of do my own research and go down rabbit holes and like, oh, this guy's also on this label. I never heard of this label. Oh my gosh, look at all this stuff. So by then I started picking up records from the golden days years after it, and I think I got this during that period. So once again, shout out to Steve Smitten for his awesome label, also for helping in the early days of Rootmaster. And oh, that reminds me, what was I going to say? Oh, that's right. So some of the acid work in this one, the way it's just rapid fire and sort of really like electric and shouting out, it reminds me of some of the acid work in one of the very first acid techno tunes I heard, the Kektex Dynamite, I think, remix of The Rabbit's Name Was, which is originally, who's the original artist on that one? I forget who is the original artist, but there's a number of remixes of that track, and I think the Kektex remix is just an all-time dynamite blaster, and something, that when I heard it I was like, oh my god, this is the punk rock of the techno world. And yeah, I think some of the acid work in this track is similar to that. And Kektex, for those who don't know, is Dave the drummer, Henry Cullen, mixed with Laurie Immersion, who is the headmaster, if you will, of the Rootmaster label, and who now is the, what is it, he's the main guy at like the Curved studio, and I'm trying to think of the name, like Curved Pressings, I think is the name, and he spends a lot of time mastering these days. So again, shout out to all the acid techno godfathers. Shout out to Smitten, aka the Vibe Bar Rejects remix of this track. Shout out to Sharkey for the original, which I assume that's where the sample comes from. I don't really know Sharkey's catalog. I just know him more through reputation, but I assume that's where the sample, the product of society, comes from. So anyway, I'll stop taking your time, but do let me know what you think of this track, and I will see you next time. Peace.